Hi, I'm Mrs. Schertz, and this is topics 1.6 and 1.7 for AP Environmental Science on the phosphorus and hydrologic cycles. All right, so our learning goal up here is to explain how phosphorus cycles within ecosystems. So the phosphorus cycle is probably new in AP Environmental Science. It's not something that is usually taught in biology or chemistry or other courses. But it's pretty easy to learn. There's not a whole lot to have to know for the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is really biologically important. It's absolutely essential for all living things because it's the backbone of DNA. Remember, when you study DNA, it has a sugar phosphate backbone, so the sides of the DNA. Super limiting in ecosystems as well because we can't make it synthetically, which means that it can only be made naturally in ecosystems, and it's very slow. The phosphorus cycle also does not have an atmospheric phase, so you can remember it that way, in that it's the only one with no atmospheric phase. Okay, so phosphorus has to be weathered from rock initially. So the largest reservoir for phosphorus is sedimentary rock, and it has to be weathered. So I have a picture here of some standing stones in England that were built thousands of years ago. So they were like square. If you've ever seen a picture of Stonehenge, this is like Stonehenge, except it's fully eroded. So you have the weathering of rock that releases phosphorus. And so it's a very, very long process to do so. So after phosphorus is released from rocks, and again, the reason why I have this is not because it's nature. So humans created these, they didn't make the rock, but they placed them in a circle, and at one time, again, several thousand years ago, they were square and they've eroded. So this is called weathering of rock. And so I have that picture there just to show you what weathering of rock looks like. Okay. Now, after it's weathered and it enters ecosystems, so the rain will hit the rock and the phosphorus will leave the rock. Not just rain, but ice will crack rocks. Lichen, you can see on these stones, there's lichen that will break down rock. It will enter your ecosystems, rivers and streams, and take it to other plants. But this is a really long process. So this is a super limiting factor in ecosystems and is a problem for humans as well, because we have to get fertilizer with phosphorus to grow enough food for 8 billion people on the planet, and it is a limiting factor. Okay, the major reservoirs, the first one you have to know is sedimentary rock and deep ocean sediments. They're together because sedimentary rock is really kind of broken down and then lands as sediments in the ocean. Soil has phosphorus, volcanic ash does, and then living things, we also produce phosphorus. So here are these terms again: assimilation and mineralization. We learned those back with the nitrogen cycle. Simulation can also be called mineralization, but basically it's when phosphorus is taken in by plants or when we eat plants as consumers. The typical form is your this particular one, PO4 3- up there is particular ion. Abiotic non-living processes that move phosphorus include sedimentation. So you have erosion and then it's deposited into sediments. We have that sedimentation. And then plate tectonics will push up that phosphorus with we call geologic uplift, and then the weathering of rock. Now, it travels slowly, as I talked about. So we found some ways to use fertilizer with phosphorus. So plants and other producers need 3 macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK. We'll study this more in Unit 4 when you study the composition of soils. So we don't have any synthetic, so there's no man-made way to make phosphorus like there is for nitrogen. So humans have figured out something called the Haber-Bosch process, Mr. Haber and Mr. Bosch, and we can make nitrogen for fertilizer in the factory. We can't do that for phosphorus. Nobody has experimented or found or discovered a way to do that. So we have to get it, we have to mine it from rocks, or we gather it from particularly poop, which is guano, from seagulls and bats. So bat caves have a ton of guano. Seagull places where they make a lot of nests and live in big colonies can also have a lot of guano, and it's extremely valuable. We use this fertilizer to put on our lawns, our gardens, our agricultural fields, and this can run off and lead to too much phosphorus in bodies of water and cause eutrophication, which is an algal bloom. And then the algae dies, is decomposed, and the decomposing bacteria use up the oxygen, and that's our eutrophication. And here it is written for you. So too much phosphorus and too much nitrogen can cause algal blooms, and then they die. The decomposition leads to hypoxic. The term hypoxic means lack of oxygen, and then a dead zone because the decomposing bacteria use up the oxygen. The algal bloom doesn't make hypoxia. Remember, algae are photosynthesizers, so they're going to add oxygen. But when the nutrients run out and they die, the decomposing bacteria that live in the water, they will use up the dissolved oxygen, create a hypoxic zone and a dead zone. So phosphorus runoff is not good because of this, and so in some states, including California, we can no longer have phosphorus in things like dishwashing detergent. There's a lot of phosphorus in soaps, and particularly dishwasher detergent. It gets those dishes nice and clean, but then the problem is that if people aren't their wastewater from their home gets into bodies of water, it can contaminate and lead to algal blooms. Okay, so phosphorus can lead to dead zones, and so you have fertilizer runoff from all of these agricultural areas in the United States. The Mississippi River runs from about here to about there, and you have this big watershed. A watershed is where any river or any piece of land that drains into a river. And so you have all these rivers and area of land that lead into the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River, again, if you're not unfamiliar with the geography, I'm trying to get it about right, but it's something like this. Huge river deposits into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's going to take with it fertilizer runoff with nitrogen and phosphorus. Both of those can cause eutrophication. And that's the Gulf of Mexico. So down here is the Gulf of Mexico, and we have large dead zones every year because of fertilizer runoff. Okay, so now we have the water cycle, which we call hydrologic cycle, is the fancy name we use in AP Environmental Science. So you should know most of the water cycle from even elementary school when you learned it. So first of all, water is essential to life on the planet. We have to have water. Okay, the sun powers the water cycle through evaporation and transpiration. So the sun is the ultimate energy that makes all the water flow. We have the largest reservoir of all water is the ocean. The largest reservoir in fresh water in particular is glaciers and ice on land. Okay, so here's our terms. Again, should be review from previous classes. Elementary school, junior high, and high school should have all covered these terms of the water cycle. So plants take in water and release them through their leaves or other parts that are green through transpiration. If you remember from biology, you looked at the stomata in the leaves to see that's where so water escapes as a gas. So transpiration is coming out as a gas. Now, not all producers have stomata, and so they're going to release it in other ways as a gas called transpiration. Then the process of evaporation and transpiration together. So big bodies of water will evaporate water from it into a gas. And that just happens from the ocean, it happens from lakes, rivers, etc. Your fish tanks lose water through evaporation. So together they're called evapotranspiration. As water comes in the form of rain, so you should know precipitation is rain or sleet or snow or basically water falling from the sky. And then it hits land and it moves, and that's called runoff. Some of that precipitation soaks into the ground. We can call that seepage or percolation. If the water that soaks on the ground ends up creating a big pool of water in that ground, we call that an aquifer or groundwater. So sometimes we can call it groundwater right here. Sometimes we can call it an aquifer. So groundwater or an aquifer. The highest level of our groundwater is called our water table. And so pay attention as you are reading in the book, you're looking at the diagrams. Pay close attention to the diagrams. Also take a look at your diagram notes as you are studying the water cycle. All right, so we have to know how humans impact the water cycle. If we remove trees, we stop evapotranspiration. We also put cement and asphalt, which stop percolation or seepage. It can also lead to more flooding. It can also lead to more erosion because the water rushes off of the cemented area, ends up on more water and more force ends up on places that are dirt. And the force of that water can cause soil erosion because it's not spread out. It's concentrated. And then do understand that for all of our biogeochemical cycles, there is conservation of matter. So look at the bottom. Unlike energy, matter is conserved in an ecosystem. So we have our nitrogen cycle, we have our carbon cycle, our phosphorus cycle, our water cycle. All of that contains matter, doesn't go away. It's called conservation of matter. And they just get cycled in different places. You also need to know what abiotic, the non-living parts of the cycle are, and the biotic, the living parts. And in all of that, the elements do not diminish. Now, later on in this unit, you're going to learn about trophic levels where energy is lost in ecosystems. So that's different, but matter is not. It just cycles in different forms in different parts, the abiotic and the biotic parts. And that's it for these two sections.